you want to. I'm just glad to be here. Well, good morning. Like the esteemed chair says, my name is Eric Honda. Right now, I've been an independent, but that might change because my family, to whom I owe pretty much all my education to, recently liquidated their assets. So if you know anyone that's hiring or needs an adjunct, I'm your man.
All right.
You have liquid assets?
No,
assets.
I have no assets. They liquidated everything. That's another story.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let me get straight to the point. Even if I have 20 minutes flies by. Besides,
It does.
I want to open it up to everybody else. Ultimately, when I really struggled with this paper and writing this because the last time I was at the CSA was in Berkeley in 2011. Well, interestingly enough, I was looking at the program and I said, man, I should have emailed them. I don't know, Chris, was Jack Fong here yesterday?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right.
It was a really interesting paper.
The reason I mentioned him is because he presented a paper on one of my sessions in 2011, and I got to thinking, I'm saying, you know, Jack, should I really tell you or should I not tell you? Because I was struggling with the fact, because I said, Jack, I could solve your problem. Not for his paper yesterday, but for his paper 4 years ago. And I said, you know what, I might as well do it. I said, Jack, I'm going to do it. I can solve this. I can solve your problem.
So that's where this paper came from.
Part of it, and partly, the name is First Image Warp. I'm just going to explain the title briefly. Chris probably knows more because you do everything. I see you to the ISA every time.
I don't do everything because no one can do everything.
You do enough.
Yeah, you do everything.
No, I don't.
You do enough. Anyway, he would know, I don't know if you know, but he would know because he knows international relations theory, and that's what I'm trained in. I'm actually a trained political scientist, but I know sociology. I do. So anyway, Kenneth Wallace, if you don't know, he wrote a book called Man, the State, and War, and he identified 3 levels of analysis. The man, which is the individual, the state, which is the 2nd level, and the system, which is the 3rd level. Anyway, so shortly thereafter, right before he wrote his best book, yes, I'm going to out myself, I love theory of international politics, but a year before, a guy named Peter Gorovich wrote a brilliant article called The Second Image Reversed, and that pretty much gave a non-Parsonian explanation of how structured agent works, meaning that the structure influences the agent rather than the agent influencing structure. Alright, but that was in IR terms, that means that the system is influencing the state. Alright, that's fine. I will concede to that. However, it goes way toward policy and also what the government's doing rather than what the individual does, because that's what sociology studies. They really study society. So I was thinking, you know what, why not influence society? So that's part of the reason why I say warp, in the sense that you bypass things and at the same time it's misdirection. So ultimately, I am suggesting in this paper that the system influences the individual. So as my first figure, I'm just pretty much summing up what I say. But it's interesting because I have something called systemic singularity, which is this: the system influencing the state, or unitary bilateralism. Because what's unclear even to this day is whether or not the system also includes bilateral relations between states. Either way, I did this as a comparison because the kicker, the mouse is frozen. Oh, noted. Okay, that's why I see. Got a laser. So ultimately, this is just the basic model. So I got the international system, I got the state at the 2nd image, and I got the individual 1st level. I'm not saying this doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that there's a bypass that goes straight toward the individual 1st image. Now, all right, that's all great. So against my better judgment, I decided to do some empirical testing which Jacques Fong lacked. Because briefly going back to his 2011 paper, he was suggesting that perceptions of hegemonic decline will ultimately lead to racism, meaning that if the American populace believes that China is on the rise or the war on terror is going on, that should lead to a sociological implication that the white American should be distrustful of Asians, should be distrustful of Muslims or anybody from Middle East Asia. All right, I would concede to that stipulation. However, that presumes and precludes the fact that first you have to define what white conservative identity is. And I said, this is where I kind of depart from what Jack is saying. So ultimately, I'm looking at what I call white conservative identity, and I have a typology. The first one is this: I have affinity, which is the first hypothesis, meaning that white identity is defined by physical appearance, meaning that people that are Caucasian are going to identify with other Caucasians, and that's going to serve as a basis to distinguish between the in-group and the non-member population. So then I have ethnicity, which is pretty much culture, and if you look at culture, that's a very messy term, but the ultimate conditions are the same, that you look at somebody in terms of shared heritage, because you could go down to things as some people that say they're Caucasian say they're Catholics, some say that they're Christian, some say that they're non-denominational, some even say that they're atheists. So that's kind of going to there. I didn't elaborate that in the paper because, I mean, this was already in 8,000 words. I mean, there's not really much room for elaboration, so I kind of cut that out. Then I have integrity, which is the idea of morality, meaning that what does it mean to be white? what is white behavior, what are their ethics, right or wrong, that's just a set of distinction. Then I go to nationality, meaning that's pretty much citizenship, distinct from ethnicity, meaning that if you're white, American, that's going to be your nationality. So I did that. And finally, relativity, or it's pretty much situation, meaning the white population relative to somebody else, or the non-member group. So ultimately, I set up a typology between affinity fiscal, affinity moderate, moral Republican, Tea Party. The reason why I attached things, and I did this purposely, I literally went from left to right, the most right-wing extreme to the most moderate to the most left-wing Republicans, if such things exist. However, because this is an empirical testing, I got it off of the possibility. So ultimately, here are the results of my first test. Ultimately, my key criterion, key predictor is the hegemonic decline.
Well, this is their attitude, or this is their belief in hegemony.
Yes, perceptual belief. Yes. Well, actually, in another work that I'm doing, because this is going to be part of something larger, I actually did the calculation, and yes, the United States is in decline, but that's for another point in time.
It's a different question.
Yes. Anyway, I find significance across all areas, despite rather low
Now, are all these other variables control variables, or
Yes, they are.
That's not just one?
No, they're all
control.
They're all controls. And interestingly enough, that's interesting you mentioned that, because they're controls rather than intervening variables, because I find significance across.
Jack, you know what? You need to tell people about the survey and sort of how you operationalize whiteness.
Okay.
Right? Nobody's going to understand what you're talking about if you don't do that.
All right. Thank you. Good point. Yes. Well, because for time and space constraints, I did not. But thank you, Chris. I will elaborate right now if I have the time. Ultimately, what I did is I ran the survey data through the latest American National Elections survey, and it pretty much it's just survey data with attitudes on a whole range of things. And I used this because, number one, that was the American Society. I chose that over than the general social survey because that was just too big, too broad, and there was too many confounding factors to control. And so I put other variables just to make sure. And there's other things such as homeland security that I thought were relevant, the Afghan timetable referring to the U.S. presidents in Afghanistan, how long Americans think that Afghanistan is really going to take. I did things like the China threat and the China economy. Interestingly enough, those were mixed results. Iranian nuclear proliferation, for example, the idea that Iran's going to build a bomb someday. Some people think they already did despite negotiations. Things like unemployment benefits, which conservatives generally disdain. I put that in there. Outsourcing.
So this is belief in unemployment benefits?
Yes.
Or whether you approve of them or something?
Yes, that they disapprove of it.
But back to racism. What are the questions that you use to operationalize whiteness?
The key question I asked is, is your identity or your affinity toward whiteness, does that increase with a belief in hegemonic decline? That is my
They
main
asked
question.
that question?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
Honestly, they asked.
Good.
Wow. They asked that question.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
it's controversial. That's why I looked at that rather than the general
Yeah,
social
yeah.
survey, because I mean, it gets to the point. And it's kind of mixed results, which was surprising. So then I went to affinity as my second hypothesis, same thing. This one shocked me because originally I thought I'd find results clear across the board, but moderates have no significance at all, whereas I find fair to strong significance across all areas in hegemonic decline.
And this one is some combination of whiteness and political, these issues.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You put those two together
Yes.
somehow.
Yes.
Is it an index? I mean, what did you do?
A product. I just turned it into a product
Okay.
with filters.
Yeah.
Now, what shocked me most here is the constant. They're off the wall. This was the highest results ever. I ran this 3 times. God, I wish I was tenured and had grad students because I'd rather have them do it because that was it was a waste of 5 hours to do this. But anyway, I did this to make sure that these were the results I had. They were off the wall. Look at this.
And the dependent variable is?
I have 5 dependents,
Five.
which are the fiscal, the moderate, the moral, the Republican, and the Tea Party.
So it's the effect of hegemonic decline
Decline,
belief
yes.
on
Yes,
these
correct.
dependent variables.
Correct. So then I went to ethnicity, get kind of more edgy, and we had the opposite results here. You got strong measures of fit for the Tea Party. I'm going to go in reverse order as the highest, but it's just barely there. And it shows no really significant difference between the Republican, which is you're pretty much a conservative. The attitude question is, would you consider yourself a conservative Republican? And and white, and they said yes, yes. And then the Tea Party, they would say, they said no, and they say they listed the Tea Party on the survey data, and with the variable hegemonic decline I added, there's not much difference between the two, or for that matter, if they were a moral Republican, if they're saying, you know what, I'm not Tea Party, I'm not Republican. And interestingly enough, they didn't ask Christian fundamentalists, but I think that's what they really meant in the survey data. Moderate, higher results, which shocked me in the fiscal, that shocked me as well, but there was nothing there because, I mean, hegemony, I mean, it's world systems theory. I mean, if there's a decline, there's always an economic ramification, and I didn't find anything there. Though, what's interesting with unemployment benefits, how they feel toward pretty much the welfare state or social services, there was significance all across the board. Now, if I listed that variable higher, that would have been your control right there, just for this one, but I did not. And then I want to also point to illegal immigration, negative relationship all across the board. They just do not want illegal immigrants. Typical conservative Republican thinking. No shock there. Finally, going to integrity, which is my other euphemism for morality. I'm recoding it to see if there is something between morality. And that's why I included so many other variables, both dependent, independent, and possible intervening, just to see, because I want to try and avoid multipolarity best as possible. Now over here, I found strong significance over there, except for the fiscal, which I expected because they're more open toward the idea of work hard, spend carefully, don't waste money. Yet there's pretty much strong significance either way with the coefficient. Afghanistan timetable, there was also a positive effect there, which is interesting because I expected something for war and terror and homeland security. Nothing much happened there except for fiscal gain. It's rather confounding. China threat, mixed results. China economy, mixed results. Again, unemployment benefits. That was to be expected, the results. Illegal immigration, same thing. Now, going down to nationality. Yeah, raise your hand or scale if I'm going over. And then finally, I looked at the idea of nationality. What does it mean to be white American? And over here, I find various mixed results, including right here, I want to know moderate, just bare significance of that. And yet conservatives call themselves patriots. Who knows? So I point to homeland security, where I found more significant results than I did with economic decline. So that's almost to the point that we've got an intervening variable there rather than just a control. I ran nuclear proliferation. This had the highest results here, that they were genuinely concerned about that as a factor of hegemonic decline. Illegal immigration, same story. Defense cutbacks here. The only place where I found significant results, that they are genuinely concerned that if the government cuts back on defense, it's going to contribute to hegemonic decline. Tax hikes, interestingly enough, I expected results then, there were nothing there. Technology expenditures, varied results. Military support, yes, they were all for that, which is in line with the fact that even though defense cutbacks is a separate variable, it kind of goes hand in hand.
If I could just ask you right now,
Yeah.
the values in parentheses are the p-values?
No, they are robust standard errors.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I should have explained all that.
Now it makes sense.
So, and then finally relativity, which really was not much significant at all because I had very, very strong, very, very mixed results. Weak to barely significant. Yet other variables such as unemployment benefits of outsourcing are very high, along with illegal immigration. Maybe that should have been my control to begin with. Who knows? So ultimately, before I use my time here, and I want to hear what you have to say in the other presentations, I just want to conclude that this is just a very preliminary study. I've got other things going on here. The next thing that I want to do beyond here is just actually go to the racial question of how does it affect with other minorities. That's maybe next CSA in Riverside, who knows.
So this is a random sample of
Yes,
U.S. voters, or whole U.S. population?
Yes, U.S. population.
Adults or?
The age range was a standard typical from age. I excluded age 18 because I mean, in other studies have shown that the idea that the right to vote does not necessarily get the younger generation to vote because voting has declined. So I looked at somebody that would have at least voted in the first two presidential elections, so that's why it boosted it up to age 26, 27, roughly there, up till age 75. I didn't go all the way, because technically, yes, you could be 95 years old and vote, but I mean, regrettably, with geriatrics, I mean, you get old, you're in nursing homes.
Excuse me, be careful.
No offense, Chris, but I'm just saying, most people are not trained scholars. I mean, statistically, for better or worse,
that.
for better or worse,
Even professors.
True.
no, for better or worse, that's why I excluded that, because the vast majority, they won't vote. Whether they're cognizant or not, they're not going to do absentee ballot. They're just not going. They're just going to get out of the system, so to speak.
So it's voters.
Yes.
That's the target.
Yes, the
Voters.
I look specifically at voters. I should have put an appendix, but I mean, I don't want you guys to read 20 more papers of what I did, but I mean, so I will say, data is available upon request, so just email me. Anyway,
Voters in 2013, right?
yes,
Yeah.
the last recent election. I mean, I would have loved to have done 2014, but the ANS regrettably does not do midterms. They only do presidential cycles, because that's when all the elections happen. So, who knows, I might just want to redo this and wait, but I mean, I can't just wait. I wanted to do this. So ultimately, as a very preliminary findings with very weak measure of fit, I call it the first image worked again, because the system is ultimately influencing how white American voters think of themselves as white, think of themselves as American, think of themselves as conservative. So ultimately, with that, I'll end and I'll leave it to you guys to discuss and give it to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. The next speaker is Dr. Evan Heimlich, and his paper is called Jumping Scale in the World System, Branding, Post-Native Speakerism, and the Meaning of Singapore. Singapore? Yeah.
Chris, is it okay if we power this down? Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today. I'm going to have to explain some terms at the start. One of the terms I'm going to use is ESL. I imagine you guys are all familiar with that term. English as second language. In 2013, an international school in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, recruited me for a position as headmaster. And when I learned that the school advertised its use of a Singapore curriculum, I began researching the usages of this phrase and similar invocations of Singapore. My findings illuminate paradigms that point beyond colonial models of ESL. Outside of Singapore, there's dozens of schools that are invoking Singapore. The set of their locations in cities of the global south matters, and so does the continuing growth of this set. And so does how and why they invoke Singapore. And so does Chinese investment in these cities' national infrastructure to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. This is a new emergence. In terms of ESL, what's happening in the world is that there's the emergence of what many people are now calling ELF, or English as lingua franca. And looking at Singapore makes that clear, because Singapore, as I'm going to explain, when it decolonized, it particularly and early embraced English expressly as a lingua franca, and not according to this colonial model where we got to learn the way that the British people speak, which is the way that they'd had it for pretty much all of the 19th century and half of the 20th century. Further research in this vein should investigate, where feasible, the staffing of the schools that are outside of Singapore that are calling themselves Singapore schools and claiming to use the Singapore curriculum. So let me explain this point, because this is a weird aspect of my paper. The schools of Singapore itself are interesting, but there's tons of research on the schools of Singapore, and there's these schools that are outside of Singapore that are calling themselves a Singapore school, or saying we offer a Singapore curriculum, are brand new. And as far as I know, I'm the only person researching it, because of this contingency that I was recruited by one of them, and I tried to figure out who they were, and I I think that the set of schools that are outside of Singapore actually are more interesting and significant than the schools in Singapore itself, because Singapore is a singularity. What it does can't be replicated by other places, but the people that are invoking it is an expanding set, and their invocation is a sign of some very important trends. So if I could, I would research the staffing of these schools. What's the nationality of the people who are teaching there? But I've been able to do some of that by looking at the websites of the schools and by visiting some of them. I went over there and I visited some of the schools, but that's not mainly what my paper is about today. But it's worth mentioning that a bunch of these schools outside Singapore, they do employ people from Singapore to teach English. They also employ people from India and people from Nigeria. And in the colonial models of ESL, you don't find that, because even though people in India and in Nigeria grow up speaking English, they're not considered to be native speakers because they're colonists. I mean, they're there to colonize, supposed to learn to speak like the colonizers. So my argument is that old model of ESL, even though it's the dominant model now, its days are numbered, and these new emergent forms are poised to take over, and meanwhile are worth paying attention to. The old model stemmed not only from colonialism but also from nationalism. Now, this is a step of the paper that I'm just gonna rush over, but I argue that what nations have been doing, particularly in East Asia and Southeast Asia, is that since they've decolonized themselves from the actual empires, they've been self-colonizing themselves, particularly with English. So there was no other model for ESL. So all right, let's just take it over ourselves and use that old colonial model. So I should also mention that I taught English in Japan for 12 years at Kobe University. So also this research is part of a project that's funded by the National Government of Japan, Ministry of Science, and this paper is the chapter of the third book of that research group. But I've also been part of Chris's Institute for Research on World Systems for the past couple of years, and Marilyn, who's also here, has been helping me a lot with this research, which so far is unpublished, but it's on its way. The rise of these Singapore schools outside of Singapore is a new paradigm that increasingly fits the conditions of our world, and it also fits with what the corporations are trying to promote. They're trying to promote globalization as if it were borderless. It's not. So that's a piece that's a little bit hard to sort out. So I'm doing the sociology of rhetoric, but not only rhetoric. I'm also looking at structural forms. For Southeast Asians, Singapore itself models a crucial emergent tendency that some geographers of capitalism call deterritorialization. I'm going to quote here. If territoriality operates as a strategy grounded on the enclosure of social relations within a bounded geographical space, so just think of a nation state, or for that matter an empire, that's what they do, deterritorialization may be understood most coherently as a countervailing strategy to jump scales, that is, to circumvent or dismantle historically entrenched scalar hierarchies. In the next section, I'm going to explain and emphasize this definition. And first, I just want to note that the focus on Asia itself matters, because Asia has not generally been considered as an origin point in the story of globalization or capitalism, but it merits that consideration. So this is something that we've been debating quite a lot for the past couple of years in IROS, and I'm coming more and more to that conclusion that it makes more and more sense to look at what's happening in East Asia and even in Southeast Asia as a driver of the changes to capitalization. Particularly, it's instructive that there's some leading research on globalization that tackles the following question. The prime challenge of English today is to wean itself away from its national and nationalist paradigm and colonial paradigms, and instead adapt to the new global givens. But what does this mean? That's a quotation from somebody who wrote in Proceedings of the Modern Language Association. In my view, this challenge falls largely to schools that teach English outside of the United States and other such countries. So my research is one case study amid an immense variety of emergent socio-spatial forms involving global interurban networks, so it's a set of cities, and transnational diasporic communities, particularly of the Han Chinese people. Globalization here is the spatial extension of social interdependencies on a worldwide scale. And when I do globalization, it entails an approach to inter-area studies. So I have a PhD in American studies. So when I do East Asian studies or Southeast Asian studies, I look at it as inter-area studies. So pretty interdisciplinary. And this approach focuses on contact zones, frontiers, and borderlands. So this is what I'm trained in and have been doing for the past several decades. The essence of my approach is to focus on interstitial places, which some define as zones of particularly intensive cross-cultural exchange. And that certainly applies to Southeast Asia for thousands of years.
Interstitial what?
Interstitial places. So I'm bringing in geography. I'm grounding it more in geography and theory of geography, and this is heavily based on work of Neil Brenner. Globalization itself is self-contradictory because it involves a conflictual dynamic of glocalization, in which global socio-spatial integration is proceeding in tandem with a pervasive triadization, regionalization, and localization of social relations. One of the interesting aspects of this term globalization is that supposedly it originated in Japan. In this sense, globalization is not actually really about the global scale becoming more important than sub-global scales. It's more significantly about changes in the very relationship between scales. So again, I'm going to explain that in a little depth in a minute. The study of globalization, as I do it, is largely a study in the sociology of rhetoric. How are people using certain rhetorics of globalization effectively to deterritorialize by jumping scales? Well, I keep saying jumping scales. I've got to explain it. So the idea is that during the 19th century, especially, the national scale became prominent, and it kind of trumped the imperial scale, and it lasted for more than 100 years. And it was a hierarchy in the sense that anything that was subnational was subordinated under the national scales. If it was local, it was considered generally less important than what was happening locally. Globalization leads to jumping of scales, where suddenly we see Singapore and these city-states around, Singapore is a city-state, but these other cities around Southeast Asia, which are not city-states, are calling themselves, or their schools are anyway, we're saying, we're a Singapore. What does that mean? For much of humanity today, capitalism is training consumers in the market at large, and various kinds of readers are hungry for stories that help us make sense of what's happening in our world with a large-scale vision of the emergent changes. In this vein, the politico-strategic aspect of globalization has played a hugely powerful role in influencing popular understandings of contemporary capitalism, what it's doing. It works in a bunch of ways. First, it works to naturalize neoliberal policy. So that, I'm not so in favor of that. It works to promote state institutional restructuring. It works to reorient corporate strategies. it works to reinterpret social identities, and it works to rally anti-capitalist resistance. I don't see a whole lot of that happening with these schools, but I see what these schools are doing, that we can understand anti-capitalist resistance in relation to what they're doing. And really what I see happening is that it's part of the rise of the global South. So it took me 2 years to arrive at this position, because at first I thought, there's no way do I want to say that capitalists in Southeast Asia are going to be able to achieve something closer to parity between the global South and the global North. But Arrighi has helped convince me that that may indeed be what's happening. The next step of my introduction section here refers to another case study that I'm looking at, which is the International Baccalaureate System. They now have 5,000 schools, including 250 state schools in Ecuador. So that's where my research is going next. So I undertook Singapore as my first case study, and then after I get this one published, then I'm going to spend the next, I think it's going to be like a 5-year project to look at what is happening, particularly in Ecuador. So let's talk about Singapore. These Singapore schools outside of Singapore are navigating the Chinese diaspora via, quote, a Singapore, even though their society's demographics are very different. The nation of Singapore has a very small land area with a majority Chinese population. It's close to 80% Han Chinese. The next biggest minority are the Malay people, who are considered indigenous there. They're 14%. And then people from India are about 7%. Of course, Singapore was a British colony. That was from 1819 until 1959. Its process of decolonization was unusually long. It lasted from the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s. And I think that its path to decolonization was singular. When it left the British Empire, initially it joined another state, which was Malaysia, 1963, but 2 years later it became sovereign and independent. So I argue that it was literally jumping scales from it was a colony of the nation, and it sort of jumped into Malaysia, and then it jumped out of Malaysia and became a city-state, and today it's really like sort of a North Star in some ways to less successful cities in Southeast Asia. So when we hear these schools, and they're all private schools, there's about close to 40 of them around Southeast Asia. When we hear what they're saying, I think that they're referring to Singapore's historical agility at jumping scale. Now, I just explained this about the national scale already, and that's what I think the schools are doing. So I go into some detail about the history of what happened with the schools in Singapore and the government, and how what these Singapore schools outside of Singapore are doing. On the one hand, it echoes what Singapore was doing when it was colonial. So it had English schools that were English. They call them English medium schools, or we call them Anglophone schools, and they were only for the elites, and it created social division. And then they overcame that in Singapore, and they established a new policy, and they said we're going to have multilingual schools, and we're going to try to have equality between the language streams. It's not clear to me how successful they've been with that, but as far as achieving equality, but they were very successful at achieving a new form of identity for Singaporeans, and that I think is very appealing for the people who are outside of Singapore involved in their schools. But the paradoxical thing is that they're not expressly saying like, yeah, we want to be like Singapore when it was a colony, but these are private schools that are very elitist. So they are like the English language schools when Singapore was a colony, and in some ways they resemble just jump to the conclusion here. One of the aspects of the rise of the global south and the emergent forms that we're seeing in the world today is particularly arising in interstices of the world system is new forms of collaboration between the state and the private sector. And Singapore has become very successful in education, first of all, in one form of collaboration that education researchers call education hub. So it's become an education hub by closely coordinating its immigration sector, its immigration policy, with the goal of bringing in people from around the world. It's just made it a government priority. They've got a great state school system. Then we have these schools outside of Singapore, which they're all private schools, but half of them, so about 20 of them, are actually affiliated with the state school system of Singapore. So they're private schools imitating public schools, which it's not. I'm sure it's not the first time that happened, but it's interesting. What we see here is a significant example of how factions of capital strive to wash away the dead weight of past investments and thus to open new possibilities for accumulation. So the colonial relationships are definitely not entirely dead weight, but they are increasingly getting washed away. The rescaling processes represent a conflictual dynamic of localization. National states continued to operate as key forms of territorialization for the social relations of capitalism, but the scalar geographies of these state-organized territorial processes have been fundamentally reconfigured. Again, certainly the nations are not at all getting washed away, but their roles are getting configured in ways that are particularly legible to those in the global north when we examine Singapore's implications of Singapore's school system. The post-1970s wave, this is the last sentence, post-1970s wave of worldwide socio-spectral restructuring has re-territorialized and rescaled inherited formulations of national territoriality and produced new constellations of political economic organization across the world economy. These constellations are tuned like these very often and significantly, when they're successful, they're attuned like the Singapore schools outside of Singapore to the diaspora of Han Chinese. And I agree with Arigi that the global south is on its way to taking good advantage of the multipolarity we see emerging in the world, and it looks like there's a decent chance that instead of having one economy dominating, that there's going to be more parity between global north and south. Thank you.
Okay, our next paper is by Sandor Nagy, who is unfortunately not able to come today. His paper is entitled The Evolution of Revolution, a Comparative Analysis of World Revolutions, 1789 and 2011. And the paper will be given by Dr. Chase Dunn, who is his advisor.
Okay, I'm not sure I've got enough of these for everybody, so if you could share a little bit. And the other thing that happened is Sandor prepared a PowerPoint. It was on my thumb drive, and I think I left the thumb drive in a computer yesterday, and I have no idea where it is.
There was a thumb drive up there. I don't
No.
know whether it was there a blue one, kind of a bluish.
Yeah, but it's not here now.
I saw it. I should have picked it up.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's all right. Anyway, I'll just wipe my arms. That's what I usually do. So, Sandor is studying world revolutions, but nobody knows what that means. He gives a for those of you who have a handout, he gives a very short definition of world revolutions. I'll read it to you. Footnote on the second page. World revolutions are constellations of clusters of major revolutions, rebellions, revolts, and uprisings that occur in the same time periods across the world system. Okay? So the unit of analysis here is the world system, whatever that is. Okay? But we've actually been talking about it all along. It's the same thing that Kenneth Waltz is talking about. Right? It's the whole system. Sanders' paper is going back several hundred years, so he's looking at that system basically, well, he starts in 1789, so that's recent, right? I would start a little earlier, but the thing is, when you talk about the world system earlier than that, or even earlier than the 19th century, you need to say what it is you really think of as the system. Is it everything on Earth or not? And following Wallerstein and other people, we see that there was a Europe-centered world system that emerged and took over a lot of the world, but not the whole world. And it didn't really take over the whole world until the 19th century. So in Sanders' paper, that's the unit of analysis. In other words, when he's talking about 1789, he's not really talking about the whole Earth. He's talking about the Europe-centered system, Europe and its colonies. Got it? Okay, so that's the system he's analyzing. And then that system got bigger and became global, arguably in the 19th century. But before that, there was a separate East Asian system. He's not really talking about that. You could ask the question he's asking about the East Asian system. That is, what is going on with social movements in the East Asian system, in particular countries, but in the whole system? Yeah, he's not doing that, but he could do it. And it would be interesting, because arguably social movements have been important all along. The other big claim in this analysis is these clusters of social movements are important for the evolution of the whole system. So it's the opposite of what Jack was talking about. It's stuff from below changing the structure of the whole system, right? It's that side of things. And I'm usually more like Jack and Kenneth Waltz. Okay, I see the system determining everybody and their ideas and their identities and so on. But when we're talking about social movements, we need to consider the possibility that social movements do have consequences. And that's what Sanders is doing here. He's saying that, yeah, there's a structure, and there's power, there's the core states and the hegemons and all that, but that system is actually evolving. It's not the same. There's lots of change in it. It's a musical chairs thing. There's uneven development. There's the rise and fall of hegemonies. There's changes in global culture. There's changes in political ideology. The notion here, and this is relevant for Evan's paper, Evan is really talking about contestation within global culture. But the idea here is, look, there was global culture all along. For most people, or in most places, it was the culture of the elites. So what's happened is it's become more generally the culture of the masses. But if you go back several hundred years, there was already global culture. And that was being contested already. And these movements contest it. They use the ideas that are dominant to make claims, basically, on the powerful. And that those claims, because they involve people rebelling and revolting and overthrowing things and causing trouble, need to be taken into account from those in power. And those in power are also, there's competition going on. That's what hegemonic rivalry is about, okay? It's about competition among elites to who can do the best job. And part of the best job is controlling these goddamn rebellions from below, handling it as best as you can. Now, the global elites, when you go back in history, they're the only ones who know that there's a rebellion in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East at the same time, right? The people in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, they never heard of each other. They have no idea. They're thinking about their local situation. But the Home Office, the British Home Office, they're the ones who know. They have a global colonial empire, and they're dealing with all its crisis management. They're dealing with all this crap at once. And it's affecting them. And they're competing with other home offices in other competing core states. And there's contestation, there's inter-imperial rivalry going on. So the ones that handle it the best are the ones who prevail, basically. This is the idea here in this world revolution thing, is it's a cause of the rise and fall of hegemons. The hegemons who succeed at best doing this are the ones who end up being the center of world power, okay? And they do that, and it's a real combination, complex thing. Yeah, it's about economic power and military power, but it's also about ideological power. Okay, it's Gramscian at the world system level. Somebody yesterday said, well, there's this Gramsci's idea of hegemony, and then there's the idea of hegemony and world system. Well, but they're both. It's all there. You weren't here yesterday, so you couldn't have said that. Somebody else.
That was the keynote speaker that said that.
Who?
That
No,
was
Bill
the
Robinson
keynote
said it last
speaker.
night. Bill Robinson said it.
Oh,
okay?
Robinson.
There's the Gramscian idea of hegemony, and then there's the world system. Right. Well, but what the world system thing does is it says, yes, these are all types of power, and they're all important. There's economic power, there's political military power, and there's ideological power. Ideological power is a struggle. It always has been, and it still is. It hasn't actually changed that much, except that more people are involved in it than before. But those competing home offices in the colonial empires were doing it. They were making claims about the white man's burden and civilization and all this crap. And that ideology kept evolving. What the hegemon has to do is present its program, its structure, as something that's not just good for it, but it's good for everybody. It has to do that. Because you can't just use power to get people to do things. I mean, military power, obviously, but even economic power. Economic power helps a lot, because you pay them. Okay? But ideological power is great because it's cheaper. You get them to go along. You get consent. It's the Gramscian thing. And you need to have that. You can't force people to do things. It doesn't work. It just causes them to rebel. They'd rather die than do it your way. Okay? So ideological power is important all along. So the big idea here in Sanders' paper is these world revolutions are a cause of changes in the structure of global culture and the global power system. Okay? So it's the ultimate opposite of what you're talking about.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Now, I will admit I'm more of a structuralist like Kenneth Waltz myself. Okay, but I'm also interested in this world revolution stuff, and I think there's something going on here. What Sander is trying to do is say what were the big world revolutions since 1789, and what are the sort of national level revolutions that are part of each world revolution. That's what he's mainly doing here, okay? So he's got a list. Let's call it a count. 1789 is interesting because, I mean, that year obviously refers to the French Revolution, but the way Sandor is thinking about it, the American Revolution, 1776, was part of the French Revolution, or the other way around, if you want, okay? That actually these are part of the same world historical event, and that the Haitian Revolution was part of it too. And that what happened in Latin America, basically decolonization, was also part of it. That what was going on was a set of ideas and structural conditions that caused big changes and revolutions, and that they were affecting each other. If you know anything about the American Revolution, the revolutionaries were all reading Montesquieu, okay? It was about the European Enlightenment. It was about citizenship. It was about the rights of man. All this crap. The American Revolution was about that too. Now, it didn't apply to everybody and all that. But then the Haitians came along. Excuse me. They read the same stuff and they said, you know, I think we're part of this too. But why shouldn't the rights of man apply to us? A bunch of slaves said that. And they rebelled. And then when Napoleon sent 12,000 troops to put them down, they killed them all. Okay, so, you know, those ideas had amazing consequences. And then the Creoles of Latin America followed the U.S. thing and decolonized with help from Haiti. So there's all these sort of, these are not really separate events. They're connected with one another. That's the big idea, okay? Now there's a problem, an issue about periodization and how you say what's in and what isn't and all that. Because he's going from 1776 to 1830 here. And really, is that an event? I mean, of course, I think globalization is an event that's been happening for 12,000 years. So, I mean, it depends on how you think about events, right? Historians don't generally like stuff like that. But there is a big issue here about what you include and what you don't include. And I think that's not easily solved. And Sander hasn't made much progress on that, because you need to say what you mean by a world revolution. And then there's the thing about, well, it has consequences, and